Morning. I don't know what you do or don't know about Oldham. I'm going to presume nothing. And Oldham, our headline stat, we are officially the most deprived town in England. They worked that out by saying we have the most number of neighbourhoods within our borough in the top 20% deprived in the country. The reality is there are other places that are more deprived than Oldham. So you can find more deprived wards and more deprived places, but we have the most of them in our borough. So we are, according to that stat, most deprived, which is a nice sexy stat that makes me sound more interesting than I am. We're in a place called Glodwick in Oldham, which is almost 100% South Asian, almost 100% Muslim. Most of the churches that were in that area are now mosques, and new mosques are springing up all the time. But our church is multicultural, so we are a combination of white working class Brits, Caribbean immigrants, Eastern Europeans from Latvia and Romania, and then an awful lot of Iranians and Afghans and Iraqis who are coming in and converting in numbers. So we are bilingual in our church. We function in English and in Farsi in pretty well everything that we do. That's about all you need to know about us, really. We're not that exciting, but you can talk to me later about that. I've been asked to speak about comfort in the church and whether we are overly comfortable. I'm going to do that with a focus on where we have gone as an evangelical movement, who's in the evangelical movement, where we are failing to reach and why. This first session, I'm mainly going to lay out what I perceive to be the problem, and then in the second session, I'm going to try and lay out some solutions. So don't feel like I'm giving you all a kicking in this first one, which it probably will feel like. But in the next one, we're going to do some solutions. So has comfort become our functional God in the evangelical church? I think it's what drives an awful lot of what goes on, and I'm going to lay out that problem, and I'm going to try and offer some biblical reflection on that as well. And then I'll look at the next session looking at the solutions to that and how we might address that. But in this session, I just want to cover three basic questions. Is there really a problem at all? Why is there a problem? And why should we even care about it? So they're going to be our three headings as we go through this session. So first off, is there a problem in our churches? Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that I reckon there is. You don't have to be a genius to think that Steve obviously reckons there is, because he's asked me to come and speak about it. So let me lay out why I think there's a problem. In his book, Knowing Our Times, John Stevens says that according to the best research available, only about 3% of the UK population are born-again believers associated with a local church. So even before we get into the nitty-gritty of what the evangelical church has been doing, Christians are not exactly rampant in the UK, are they? Now, in hard numbers, on 3% of the population, my calculator tells me there are about 200,000 believers in the UK. Now, when we wrap our heads around just how tiny that stat is, when we compare it to 70-odd million people, we're going to get a sense of how bad the rest of these stats are that I'm going to give you in a second. So when we look at the spread of FIEC and gospel partnership churches, there is a very clear pattern in the UK. So Tom Basford, who's a blogger and statistician, has mapped the spread of our churches. 65% of gospel partnership churches are in the south, and 35% of them are in the north. The FIEC, similar, 60% of churches in the north, 40% in the south. So there are nearly twice the number of our churches in the south as the north. Now, the first objection you get to that is that you don't, surely we need to take account of the relative population of different areas as well. And that is true. We do have to do that. But helpfully, Tom's graphed the number of churches by the millions by head of population. So the southeast, the east of England, and the southwest are ahead of any other area in the country. So they have more churches per head by some considerable way. Then if we look at the makeup of those churches, there's another pattern. So the 2015 Talking Jesus research, it was commissioned by the Evangelical Alliance, found that 81% of practicing Christians have a university degree or higher. Now, while university access has increased in recent years, only about 30% of the UK population holds a university degree. So we are outstripping university-educated people in our churches compared to the wider population by some considerable way. So just to recap that so far, churches in the south outnumber those in the north by a ratio of about 2 to 1. The makeup of those churches is overwhelmingly degree educated, and the majority of the UK population have never set foot in a university. But we can also see the stats on where existing churches have been placed as well. So leaving aside north and south, what kind of neighbourhoods are our churches predominantly in? Again, Tom Basford says this: if you live in an area within the most deprived 10% of the country, it will be harder for you to find a congregation linked to the Gospel Partnership, as this is where they have the fewest churches, which is only 7.8% of their churches. The FIEC has slightly more churches in deprived communities than that, but the majority of its churches are in the top 20% most affluent communities in our country. What's more, John Stevens, who's the National Director of FIEC, has said the churches in poorer communities are generally smaller, so an analysis of numbers attending would reveal an even greater disparity. So, I know that's a load of stats that you're probably not going to retain, but let me bring together some of the key points here. Firstly, the overwhelming majority of our churches are in the south, nearly double the number than in the north, and the vast majority of those are in the southeast and London. London is by far and away the most churched part of the UK, whether you're doing that by sheer number or you're doing that by head of population. Second, there are more churches per head of population in the south than in the north. Again, London and the southeast head and shoulder above any other area. Third, the makeup of our churches is disproportionately university educated, so higher education among evangelicals is about 3 times higher than in the wider population. Fourth, the fewest of our churches are in deprived communities, with the majority in relatively affluent and aspirant places. Fifth, our churches in deprived and working class areas tend to be smaller than our churches in affluent areas. So not only are most of our churches located in more affluent communities, but most of our people, a disproportionate number of our people, are going to those affluent and aspirant churches as well. And what that tells us is, as a movement, we are failing to reach the working classes. We are failing to reach the poor. We are failing to reach deprived communities. We're filling our churches with middle-class people, and then we're planting in middle-class areas, and then we're begetting more and more and more of the same. Now, I want to be clear at this point, before anybody has a go at me later. I'm going to cut this point off now. Middle-class people need the gospel too, okay? So we're not saying they don't need the gospel. Don't take any of this as me saying we don't need middle-class churches, or we don't need people to go to middle-class areas, or that we don't want middle-class people. None of that is true. We want the gospel to go to wherever there are people. And middle-class people, believe it or not, I understand, are people as well, right? So that's all right. But the problem's not that the middle class are in the church. That's really not the issue here. The issue is that a whole demographic is missing from our churches. We have missed large swathes of the population in favour of another section of the population, and that's a big problem. It should be a joy to us that middle class people are being reached, being saved, but it should be a cause of great shame that working class and ethnic minority people are almost entirely invisible in our churches. And we have very, very few churches in the communities where they live. Very few. So I'm not here to have a go at middle class people, honestly. I promise. And I'm not saying you don't need the gospel. I'm just saying that working class and BME people need the gospel as well. And we've basically ignored them as a movement. And if we're genuine about seeing the gospel go to all people, then we have to ask some hard questions about why certain demographics are hardly represented at all in the church. We need to recognise that there is a problem, and we need to be honest about why there is a problem, because that's the only way we're going to start reaching people, isn't it, if we see that there is an issue here. So that's why I think there is a problem. How has that problem come about? Well, historically, this really wasn't an issue. So in his book on 18th century Methodism, Robert Wearmouth says the higher classes were barely touched by Methodist influence, but the working men and women were profoundly affected. So Methodism was historically centred among the working classes. David Bebbington says in the mid to late 18th century, working class artisans made up 23% of society, but accounted for nearly 60% of evangelical nonconformity. So the majority of nonconformists were skilled labourers. Tim Chester says that during that same period, the middle classes were hugely underrepresented in nonconformist ranks. It's also notable when you think about the various Great Awakenings in Britain, or the Welsh Revival, or the East Anglian Revival, all of those revolved around the working classes. So things were not always the way they are now, but I think the question still remains, why are the working classes underrepresented in our churches today when historically they were the evangelical bread and butter? I think there are four possible reasons why this has happened. First, in certain circles, there's been an emphasis on reaching the influential. That was a policy among a lot of evangelical Anglicans for a while. So things like bash camps, the key boys from key schools ethos, GLOD, camps specifically for people from independent schools, they're all part of that. It's not exclusively where the problem lies, but that's an issue. There are also people like Tim Keller who've pushed this idea of reaching the influential to create a kind of trickle-down effect in mission. But what that tended to mean is we reached the influential and then stopped. So there was a policy of reaching influential people that has been pursued for quite a while. Second, church going in general has been viewed by a lot of people as a respectable sort of activity. So even until recently, and there are still some holdouts on this, there was like a Sunday best mentality that meant the church felt to many poor people that this just isn't for me. Everybody's turning up in their shirt and tie, in their Sunday best stuff, and a guy turning up in a pair of trackies and Adidas two stripes or whatever isn't going to fit in, is he? Alongside that, those who led and spoke at services were always deemed respectable blokes who are at the front. Again, Anglican clericalism and its focus long before nonconformists on theological education made it quite susceptible to that. Nonconformity has jumped headlong into exactly that same situation. You won't find many nonconformist ministers now without a degree or formal theological education these days, which sends a very clear message to the working classes and to deprived people who haven't left school, who didn't finish school and formal education, that this isn't for you. You are not somebody who's going to make it into a pulpit. Many people in the pulpits don't speak with regional accents or dress like locals. That adds to this emphasis that it's not really a place for them. No one at the front would ever get to the front who didn't look and sound like a middle class person. So our churches are set up in such a way that make it apparent when people walk through the door that this isn't really a place for them. Third thing, Tim Chester points out that the gospel often travels along relational lines. So there's a sense that like begets like, isn't there? So I become a believer, I reach my mates who are like me, and then they go and reach their mates who are also quite a lot like me. So middle class people have networks that tend to be quite wide, tend to transcend geography because they move around a lot. Whereas the working classes tend to be quite geographically bound in their relationships. So if you go to a council estate, a lot of people won't leave that council estate. They don't see a reason to leave that council estate. Whereas the middle classes aren't like that. They move away from family links, they move away from the places they grew up for work, for all sorts of reasons. And that means that the middle classes have a much wider scope to reach people who are similar to them. And that's to some degree natural. But as we reach more and more middle class people, they go and reach their middle class friends who reach their middle class friends, and like just begets like in the church. Fourth issue, there is a phenomena of social lift. So when people become believers, they begin to be changed by the gospel. They do start to become more aspirant and more keen to climb the social ladder, so to speak. And as they develop those aspirations, they want to move away from the areas where they grew up. And when that happens, they move to middle-class areas because they are the nicer areas to live in, and then they join middle-class churches, and then they begin to acclimatise to their middle-class surroundings so that they're not so good at reaching the people from the places they once came from. That takes them away from their working-class community, makes them less likely to reach the people who were just like them. So that's some of how we became a middle-class movement, and that might be broadly interesting historically, but what is it that keeps us that way? Because we have stayed that way. So one reason that we've already touched on is that like begets like. So we have become middle class, and the reality is unless we make a concerted effort otherwise, we're going to remain that way because we'll reach our friends in the areas that we live. So unless we are actively prepared to up sticks and move to a deprived community and go and live among people who are not middle class and purposefully reach people who are not like us, we're simply not going to reach the poor and deprived. That's the bottom line. But that begs another question, that if we recognise there's a problem and accept that like begets like, why don't we purposefully choose to go to deprived communities and reach the working class and poor? Because we're not doing that. And I think there are two basic reasons here. I think the first reason is we're scared. So I highly doubt most of us are being swayed by the stats on life in deprived places, because the reality is most of us aren't looking at them. Most of us don't know what they are. We're scared, I think, by how we imagine life to be on a council estate, or how we imagine life to be in a rough part of town, even though we've never been there. And so given that most of us don't live there, that's not born out of experience, is it? It's born out of snippets of facts that we've gleaned from newspapers or whatever, and a frankly overactive imagination, I think. So I went to present about our work in a very middle-class village church a while ago. Lovely set of godly believers, and we told them about our work in Muslim part of town, very South Asian, all the rest of it. And one man came up to me afterwards, and the first thing he said was, "Oh, you're a brave man." That was his response. Now, why would he say that? Because I think it's very easy to belittle that and mock it and say, what a stupid attitude that is. Actually, he's lived in a village all his life. He's never so much as clapped eyes on a South Asian person. I doubt he's ever spoken to a Muslim. I know the man very well, so I'm not presuming this. I know this to be true. And yet he's adamant. There's something very, very brave about what we're doing. Why is that? I think there are lots of reasons. One of the things is that he's heard stories in the media, hasn't he, about Muslims. So what do you hear about in the media when people mention Muslims? I think there are two main things you hear about. One is terrorist atrocities, and the other are normally Muslim regimes in the Middle East who are busy trying to blow each other to smithereens. And they take periodic breaks from that to go and put a fatwa on someone in the West. That's what you hear about. And then people go, Glodic is full of these South Asian Muslims. And they assume that going there is choosing to surround yourself with the Afghan Taliban or something. You know, it's not like that. Really, it's not. But like I say, I think it's very easy to mock that sort of attitude. It's very easy to say, isn't that silly? That's where it comes from, in part, because we all have a fear of the unknown other, don't we? People we don't know, people we don't spend time with. It's very easy to assume they are a particular way, when actually we don't know anything about it. And if only ever hear stories demonising people, we never actually interact with them, we're then going to create images of what those people are like in our mind. And then we don't just do it with Muslims, we do it with council estates as well. Most of us don't live on council estates and hardly ever rub shoulders with people from council estates. When we do, the way that they dress, the way that they speak, the way that we see them behave in the snippets where we see them, based on our limited knowledge of them, often reinforces a picture of them that we've concocted in our mind. We create a picture of what life must be like in those places, and then we absolutely terrify ourselves about the thought of going and living there. And that image in our head is so grim that the idea of moving into that place is just absurd. You think, why would I go there when people are like that? And actually, it's just an idea that we've created in our own mind, based on, let's be honest, very little indeed. So that's one reason we don't go. We're scared of that. But second, I think if we get over the nonsense that we dream up in our own heads about what life is like, we start thinking about all the things we will have to give up personally to go. So we worry about the kind of house we'll live in, we worry about the kind of work we'll get, and we worry about the biggest middle class idol of all, our children. They might have to mix with Asian people. They might have to mix with poor people. Chantel from the council estate. We assume they will be pregnant by the time they're teenagers, based on nothing. We worry they'll have to go to a school rated satisfactory. I mean, here's the truth of it, honestly. I think if we could wish churches into existence on council estates in deprived communities without having to go and without any cost at all to ourselves, we would have a church in every deprived community in the country. We're on board with it happening, I think. I don't think anybody would ever put their hand up and say, I don't want to see a church in a deprived community. But they're not happening because we know that we're the ones who have to make it happen. They're not happening because we're the ones who are going to have to go and do it. And at the risk of being overly controversial, I don't think the recent focus on church planting has been our friend on this issue, at all. Now, I'm all for planting. I do think we need to plant churches, and I particularly think we need to plant churches in deprived communities. I think that has to happen as part of a wider plan. So don't hear me saying don't plant or planting is bad. That's not what I'm saying here. But the focus on planting, I think, has led to a very unhealthy desire to plant. So because planting carries kudos, because being a planter carries kudos, people are very quick to plant because planting is deemed a good of itself. It almost doesn't matter where you plant or how you plant or whom you plant among. If you've planted, and that's great. And that's deemed a good. And it doesn't always lead to excellent outcomes. So many big churches, for example, have just drawn a line around where existing members live and then stuck a church in their midst, which primarily serves the people who are already coming to church anyway. And because it's a plant, that's touted as a great win for the kingdom. But it's done nothing for the kingdom. That's added literally nothing. You've just bought a building and spent money on a building or a place for those people to meet that's slightly more convenient than where they were going before. That's not in any way valuable. If anything, it takes resources away from potential plants where there are no churches in virgin territory or where there are no believers to serve an existing group of Christians in their own building. That's not planting, is it? That's just self-serving. That's convenience. I spoke to one minister who planted in a fairly leafy area. I got asked, someone was looking to plant, I got asked in Manchester where they should go. I said, look north, look east, because there's nothing. They didn't plant north and east. And I asked why they went to the place they went to rather than one of the more deprived communities that doesn't have a church. And I was told two things. One, he said, realistically, we couldn't get our people to move there, which I thought was pretty appalling, if I'm honest. Because who's that plant serving? Because that isn't a kingdom-minded view of planting, is it? The other thing I was told was that the guy they had come in to plant, the reason he went to the place they went to was because he was a good fit for that area, even though that area already had an existing evangelical church in it. But of course, it was a nice middle-class area, quite an artsy area of the town, quite quite a pleasant place to live, and so they could get their people to move there. The guy was a good fit there. And the people in North Manchester who are poor and in the council estates in deprived communities can just, never mind, someone else will go, right? And I think the fact of the matter is that is not a story that is unique. I wish I could say that is the first time I'd heard that kind of attitude, and it's not. I hear it all the time. And the reality is we're just too comfortable. The number one reason we don't plant in deprived communities is that we are too comfortable and we are unwilling to do anything that makes us uncomfortable. Why won't they go to North Manchester? It's just as close to the city centre where half of them work as where they are now, but it's just too uncomfortable. And that idol of comfort, I think, has led to another pretty unpleasant moral decision, hasn't it? We're implicitly willing to allow the poor and the deprived to head to hell because the areas that they live in don't really do anything for our aspirations, do they? Their cafes aren't quite good enough. Their schools aren't quite good enough. And so we're happy to condemn people to a lost eternity as a result. You know, I just think that is such a poor attitude. We have lost, I was talking to Steve yesterday, we've lost the missionary spirit that used to exist. We used to go to places that were hard, not because people love living in hard places, but because people needed to hear the gospel. Whereas now we don't go to hard places because people don't like it. I can't imagine myself living there. I'm not sure I'm keen on it. Well, thirdly, I think it bears asking, why should we care? There may be a problem. There may be reasons why it happens and why it exists. Why should we even care about it? Why should we be bothered? Maybe we've missed some folk. Maybe we haven't gone to every community, but so what? You know, we've got to go somewhere. And I think we'll happily justify that by saying maybe that self-selection is God's means of taking the gospel to wherever he happens to want it. I'm going to offer 3 reasons why I think this matters. I think first we should care because the Lord cares about it. If we look at 2 Peter 3:9, the Lord doesn't desire that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. So the Lord wants all people everywhere to repent. The Great Commission calls us to go into all the world and preach the gospel. All reaching repentance and going into all the world necessarily involves going to deprived communities, necessarily involves going to harder places. Not only does the Lord long for the poor to be saved, but he has a specific heart for them. Jesus calls the gospel good news to the poor. I think we're quick to explain that away. I think elsewhere it's very clear. He's talking about the materially poor. It's good news to the poor. As we read the Gospels, Jesus spends his time with the poor and the marginalised, saying, blessed are the poor. One says poor in spirit, one doesn't. James says, religion that is pure and undefiled means caring for the poor. Ephesians 4:28 talks about working and no longer stealing so that you may have something to share with those who are in need. You can't share with those who are in need if you don't know anyone who's in need. You can't share with those who are in need unless you're living among people who have needs. That's service to the poor. Religion that is pure and undefiled involves being among the poor. The Lord cares for the poor and the marginalised, and he cares specifically about the salvation. Well, the question for us is whether we care about the poor as much as the Lord does. Second reason we should care is because that is where most fruit lies. So we all know anecdotally, don't we, just how hard it is to reach middle class people. You know, we talk about hard places like that's Oldham. I don't think Oldham is a hard place because people listen to the gospel. People hear the gospel. I've got people who are Muslim who understand the idea of scripture and who are sent to an awful lot of the stuff that you daren't even talk about in middle class communities. I talk to people about hell as a point of conversation starting, you know, and they're okay with that. They're fine with that. I've got people from council estates who come into my church and ask me, do you think I'm going to hell? And the answer to that is yes, I do, unless you trust in Jesus Christ. And that is deemed a perfectly acceptable way to begin a conversation. Now, We can have those conversations. I haven't met anybody yet in my community who doesn't realise they need a saviour. Not a single person. They may not recognise yet that it's Jesus Christ, but they all accept that they need something. I have not met many people in middle-class communities who have that same realisation. So you can talk to me about poor, deprived areas being hard. I think your area is often harder than mine because you can't have those conversations as easily. But we all know anecdotally about this. But it's not anything new. This is what Jesus says. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. That strikes me as a very flawed approach then, that we are primarily targeting those people who are going to find it harder than a camel going through the eye of a needle. If nothing else, we've got to question our strategy of going after middle-class wealthy people on that ground. Then we've got James. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom? We can't over-spiritualize that because he's quite specific. It's those who are poor in the world, not poor in spirit or poor in faith. The materially and influentially poor God has chosen. We've also got Paul. Not many of you are wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak to shame the strong. That is not a manifesto, is it, for reaching the rich and the wealthy and the influential as a matter of priority, is it? We've already seen how that's played out historically, so the major revivals and much of British church history centred on the working classes, but the same is true today. Again, in Knowing Our Times, John Stevens says this: there seems to be a greater gospel response at present among the very rich and the very poor. In contrast, the most hardened communities to the gospel are those that are white British, moderately affluent and aspirant. They have little apparent interest in or need for the gospel. Now, who are we seeing fruit among? The very rich, the ultra-rich, and the very poor. Now, given the sheer number of people who are very poor compared to the sheer number of people who are very rich, where are we going to see most fruit? It's among the poor. We're most likely to see gospel fruit amongst the poorest in society. So if you care about gospel advance and you care about disciples of Jesus Christ being made, then you need to seriously consider focusing on the poor and deprived, because that is where fruit currently lies. The third reason, I'm going to close with this, and you can get angry at me in a minute. It should matter because I think it speaks to our salvation. This is probably going to be the most controversial bit, but it does speak to our salvation. Because if we have made comfort our functional God, then that means Christ is not our functional saviour. It means we're worshipping an idol of comfort. And if we are saying to ourselves, no matter how we dress it up, that our comfort is more important to us than Christ's command to go into all the world and preach the gospel, then we do need to ask some very serious questions, don't we, about our standing in Christ, right? Now, I want to be clear, not everybody is called into deprived communities, but can we honestly say that we're not going because we don't really believe we've been called? Or are we not really going because our comfort is really more alluring to us than the promises of Christ? And if that's the case, I struggle to see how that's not a salvation issue. Because we're worshipping a false God that's not going to save us. Now, again, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying if you haven't gone to a deprived community, then you are de facto not saved. That would be insane, and I don't think that. What I am saying, though, is if you have a settled conviction that deprived communities need the gospel, but you won't go because you're comfortable as you are, and you have no interest in sending other people because it's frankly too much like hard work, and it's just not on your radar because you're really not that bothered, then what does that say about your love for Christ? What does that say about your love for his commands? What does that say about his heart being for the poor and your heart clearly not being? And I think that is a serious salvation issue that we have to grapple with. I don't think it's good enough just to say we're not called to that. Because it can't be right that nobody is called to that. And that's basically what we're saying at the moment. I'm not called to that, and nor is anybody else. And I struggle to see how we're obeying Christ by not sending anybody, whether that's you or someone else, or at least seriously trying. It says something about our heart, it says something about our standing. And if we are worshipping a functional idol, then we're not worshipping a real saviour. And that has got to be a problem. And I don't think we grapple with that nearly enough. I think we comfort ourselves, we look at our friends who comfort themselves the same way, and then we tell ourselves that's okay because everybody else thinks like I do. And that's a problem. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to let you ask things or tell me off.
You've got a few. It's not really a question. Can you just tell us a bit about your story?
My story?
Kind of what brought you to... You told us a bit about the church. So it's not, I don't want to take people's time, but I thought I'd like to know just a bit about you and what brought you to where you are now.
So this is where I come a cropper, really, because I was no more...
It's not...
No, I get it, but I was no more convicted than anybody else about the idea of going to a deprived community. The bottom line is, I was asked to go, so I went. I wasn't looking for a pastorate, and I wasn't looking to go into the pastorate. I was at a church in Manchester as just a guy at the church, serving as you would serve. There was a church not far away in Oldham that wanted some help with preaching. I didn't know at the time the minister was retiring. So I just went as a guy who was helping fill a pulpit for a bit. I suppose, but I can honestly, I don't remember, some discussion about theological training or something like that probably came up. I have a master's degree in theology, which I just did for the sake of doing a while ago. So I wasn't looking for a job, and I didn't know they were looking for a pastor, and I just went to help them. And I got a phone call asking me if I wanted a job, having gone a few times to preach for them and met people and spoke with them. So they asked if I wanted a job, and I hadn't really thought about it. So I asked our elders what they thought, and they couldn't wait to get rid of me. So I went, really. That was pretty well how it happened. So I didn't go out of some burning conviction that's where I should go. I went because somebody asked. It turned out I went into a revitalisation job without realising it. And it's entirely possible I may not have gone had I known what I now know. But I didn't, and I went, and now it's better. So, so it's fine now. But I think the Lord does that. He kind of hedges you in a bit, doesn't he? So you don't always know everything, and then you go and you do stuff that he wants you to do, and then you end up doing it. And then, as it happens, that's what was meant to happen, wasn't it? Because he's planned it. So that's my story anyway, but it's not anything clever.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got one question. I think you probably address in the second half a bit, so maybe save this, and then I've got another question.
Ask that question. I'll tell you if I'll answer it in a minute.
You mentioned in your list of things that were a problem with kind of middle class begetting middle class, and you said that an Anglican drive to theological education has been picked up in the Free Church, and you mentioned that as a problem. I just wondered why you felt that, really.
Yeah, so again, I want to be clear. I'm not against theological education. I think it's a good thing, and we want people to be well trained. I think the problem we've got, in fact, I'm going to answer that at some length in the next bit, but I think our theological education is broken as a pretty well all colleges. So there's not a single college, I think, doing theological education as we need it in the church, and certainly not in such a way that it's going to serve deprived communities. I don't think there is a route for people from my church. So most of my church have no formal qualification at all, would have left school, frankly, before 16. Don't have any possibility of jumping into a college course. And the answer to that we have from theological education at the moment is, why don't you do a graduate diploma? Well, how many of my people are going to jump onto that? How many people who don't even have 2 GCSEs to rub together are going to be jumping into any college that you can think of? That's just getting in. And then when you actually look at how they teach the courses, they're not set up for people from my community. They're not set up for people who would be excellent pastors, excellent Bible teachers, couldn't write an essay, couldn't read through 20 volumes of systematic theology and then write a paper about it, but they could preach, and they can do pastoral work, and they can share the gospel, but apparently they're not cut out to be pastors. That's the problem we've got. I think theological education is broken. It's not that I don't want people trained, I do, but I think our training doesn't work. Keep it higher.
Perhaps just following on from that, how does evangelism differ in a, what do we need to get right for evangelism when we're working amongst, and I'm going to call them, controversially, the lower classes, because it's not just working class, it's benefit class, it's the folk who are at the bottom end of society. Can you just talk to how, you've just touched on how pastoring looks a bit different, but a great need is surely evangelists, and what does evangelism look like?
So, yeah, they don't like being called the lower classes. They call themselves working class. It doesn't matter whether they're on benefits or not, that's how they would identify themselves. I think it doesn't differ particularly, you just need to go out and share the gospel with people. So the number one problem we've got is we're just not doing that. I mean, we don't have churches in the community for them to go to anyway. So you could see people, I mean, I know a guy who, he did set up an evangelistic ministry in the council estate he comes from, and as people were getting saved, he just didn't have a church to send them to. That was a big problem, really. He asked for help in setting that church up, and he was told no one will come. So you have to do it. He wasn't trained, he didn't have anything, he just had to get on and do it. So one of the big problems is we don't have churches there anyway. You need churches in those areas if you're going to see sustainable evangelism going on, because the church is the vehicle for mission, isn't it? So unless you've got church in those communities, you're not going to see that. You might get people, what you often get is people doing effectively a colonial expedition into the, I went to a church, very middle class church, in a very middle class area, but the people in the church decided they had a heart for the poor area. Not such a heart that anybody went there, not such a heart that anyone moved in, but a heart that meant we'll run a youth group there once a week. But everybody drove in and drove out, and unsurprisingly, no one came to the church. You can't reach those sorts of areas that way. You have to live among them, otherwise people just get the sense, and to be honest, I don't think it's unreasonable that you're just holding your nose when you go in there. So that's the big problem. I don't think evangelism differs except for it's easier. So I've never had a problem talking with anyone about the gospel. I've never had a problem talking to anybody. All the things you don't want to talk about in a middle class community. You don't talk about hell because people don't like it. You don't talk about sin because people don't like it. You don't talk about all the things that are going to get people hot under the collar. Well, in my community, talking about sin is fine. Talking about LGBT issues and saying what the Bible says about it tallies fully with what they already think anyway. Talking about hell and the fact that people are going there tallies with what they already think anyway. Talking about God and assuming the existence of God, obviously Muslims believe in a God, but most people on council estates do as well. Atheism does not rule on a council estate, whereas in the middle class communities you've got a sort of atheism or an agnosticism, which is probably at large. Evangelism is easy, but people won't listen to you unless you live there. People won't listen to you unless you show that you're actually bothered about the area. If you just bus in and bus out and drive in and drive out, then no one will listen to you. And to be honest with you, why should they? I wouldn't. And so that's the only difference. I just think you can't necessarily schedule everything. You can't necessarily say, you know, with working with Muslims, for example, you can plan a meeting a month ahead of time. You can't guarantee that that meeting will still be there the day before it's due. So occasionally you're having to plan meetings last minute, but the reality is it's it's the same. You're just sharing the gospel the same way. People respond to frankness. People respond to directness. People respond to just being told the truth, whereas a lot of middle class people don't. A lot of middle class people like things couched in careful language and nuance. Our people don't. They just want to be told the truth. And yeah, that's it. It's not rocket science, really, I think. Have I answered your question? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Anyone else? We've got a few minutes.
Yeah, just a question on being relational. I don't think it's a matter of people don't care to go in more deprived area, but it's a matter of not understanding the culture of poor area. If one doesn't understand what it's like to go without a meal because the benefits haven't come through, or be discriminated against because you're the wrong color or the wrong religion, it's not that Christians don't care, it's that even if you open your mouth to share something, they think you're not one of us. And so there is a barrier by virtue of the fact that we're middle class. It's not a sin, and it's not a sin to be poor, but there is a barrier already there. So I'm saying, how do we become relational when the moment you open your mouth, they think, well, you're not one of us?
Well, I think because we're not going, though, that's the thing. We want to share the gospel with people without having to give up our existing home, our existing family life, our existing setup. And so people say, I want to share the gospel with the poor, but I want to do it on my terms. That's the issue. I don't think it's even and actually, you look at any mission endeavour, you wouldn't say to somebody, well, there's a barrier between you and the Chinese, for example. I mean, my brother's a missionary in China, white English guy, but you wouldn't go, because there's a barrier there, it's really hard. What do we do? Well, you do all the sort of things that everybody expects a missionary to do, which is you learn the culture, you learn the language, you go, and then you share the gospel, and you go and live among people. We don't want to do that in working class areas. What we want to do is say, well, I just want to sort of bus in, share the gospel, expect people to become Christians, and then come out again. That's the problem. I mean, how many friends have we got on council estates? I mean, if we don't have any friends on a council estate, that's the problem, isn't it? If we don't have any friends who are Muslims, that's a problem. If we don't have any friends who live in those areas, that's the issue. And it's not principally barrier. I've got middle class people in my church who've got working class friends, and they're reaching working class people, but it's because they live among them. And they learn the language. I went into an area, I'm not from Oldham, I'm from a more working class background, but I'm not from Oldham. So even going to Oldham, you can't just talk about deprived community. So my family are from Liverpool, and I grew up in council estate in Birkenhead. You can't jump from that to Oldham and go, okay, it's deprived, it'll be the same. I didn't see a single Muslim when I was in Birkenhead. It's a white town. You go to Oldham, a very segregated town with lots and lots of South Asians there. So even on that front, it's not the same. Then you think of the local culture. Little silly things, like in Oldham, there's pie at everything. You have pie for every single event or function or anything. There is a flipping pie somewhere. Now in Birkenhead, you don't do that. It's just not that sort of town, and that's just the food you eat, And so, even going from one deprived community to another, you still have to. You're still a cultural outsider because you're not from the place. And like with anything, you have to learn it, and you learn it by going and being among the people. And like I say, I don't think we can expect people to listen to us if they have a sense. It doesn't matter whether you may really love them, you may not, I don't know. But if they have a sense that you don't love them, they're not going to listen to you. And I can't see a faster way to communicate that I don't really like you that much by going, I refuse to come and live anywhere near you. That's just going to communicate that, isn't it?
Sorry, somebody had their hand up. I found it really interesting, your point about historically that the work at revivals have happened amongst working class. And alongside your point about like begets like, what has caused that change, do you think, towards more middle classness?
So some of the things we talked about, social lift has been one. So as people kind of become more aspirant, they then make, sometimes it's just they make money. And if you make money, I mean, bear in mind, a lot of people on council estates don't really want to live there any more than you do. It's just that they don't have the worldview to leave, and they don't have the money to leave, and they don't have the opportunity to leave. So when they do make a bit of money, they've spent their life trying to get off of the estate. This is one of the difficulties we have in our churches, where we get people who come in, they become believers, they get a job, their outlook changes a bit, and then you're desperately trying to tell them, don't leave, stay and try and reach the people who are here. And they're sitting there thinking to themselves, well, everyone else has gone, and that's what you do, isn't it? Because that is what people do. They make a bit of money and go. So you get that drift out. I think we've focused a lot on universities. So if you look at where we've been very effective, UCCF have been very effective in universities. And again, you see students saved, then they either stick around their student areas. Student areas very often are poor areas that then gentrify because the students stay there. And the people who always lose out on gentrification are the poor, because they then can't afford to live in the community that they lived in, and they have to move out to the cheaper housing. And then a church forms around the people who were saved from that community. And so it just sort of begets and begets and begets the same situation, really. So I think sometimes it's just a focus of where we've done evangelism. It's not to belittle student work, I think that's good, but it's to say, I think because we've been successful in that, people see folks saved, gentrify their areas, stay in the areas, and then you, unsurprisingly, get churches popping up in student areas. I mean, there are churches who set up churches specifically to be student churches. I mean, that's a clear policy of doing exactly that. We're just not seeing that same view of going to deprived areas. And I just think over the course of, 20, 30, 40 years of doing that, it's just got more and more and more like this. I think there are other factors, but